Sarah Martinez pressed her back against the cold concrete wall of the abandoned warehouse, her wrists burning from the coarse rope that bound them behind her. The metal taste of fear filled her mouth as she tried to steady her breathing. 3 days ago, she had been covering a routine city council meeting for the San Diego Tribune. Now she was a prisoner in what appeared to be a human trafficking operation that stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined. The investigative journalist had stumbled onto the story while researching a seemingly innocent article about new construction permits in the Harbor District. What started as a mundane assignment about urban development had led her down a dark path of shell companies, suspicious cash transactions, and shipping manifests that didn't add up. Sarah had always been thorough in her research, perhaps too thorough for her own good. It began when she noticed the same name appearing on multiple property deeds throughout the warehouse district. Markus Volkov, a businessman with ties to Eastern European shipping companies, had been quietly purchasing waterfront properties through various LLC entities. The pattern seemed odd enough to warrant a deeper look, but what Sarah discovered in the public records office made her blood run cold. The shipping schedules didn't match the cargo manifests. Containers were arriving with declared weights that varied wildly from their actual recorded weights at the port scales. More disturbing were the utility bills for buildings that were supposedly empty. Someone was using massive amounts of electricity and water in facilities that should have been vacant. Sarah spent weeks building her case, cross-referencing financial records with immigration patterns, missing person reports, and suspicious activity near the harbor. She discovered that young women from various countries were arriving in San Diego through unofficial channels, their identities scrubbed from any official documentation once they entered Volkov's network. The breakthrough came when she found Elena Popescu, a Romanian woman who had escaped from one of Volkov's operations 6 months earlier. Elena was working at a small restaurant downtown, keeping a low profile and living in constant fear. It took Sarah 3 attempts to gain Elena's trust, but eventually the woman agreed to share her story. Elena described a sophisticated operation where women were promised legitimate work in America but instead found themselves trapped in a cycle of forced labor and abuse. They were moved between different locations every few weeks, never staying in one place long enough to establish connections or seek help. The operation extended beyond San Diego, with networks in Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas. They keep papers, Elena had whispered during their clandestine meeting in a church basement. Documents, photos, everything. If you could find the main office, you would have proof of everything. That information led Sarah to begin surveillance of a particular warehouse complex near the port. For 2 weeks, she observed the patterns of activity, noting the times when different vehicles arrived and departed. She photographed license plates, recorded descriptions of individuals entering and leaving the premises, and mapped out what appeared to be a well-organized criminal enterprise. Her mistake was getting too close. On the evening she was captured, Sarah had decided to attempt a closer look at one of the buildings. Armed with a small camera and recording device, she had managed to photograph several shipping containers and document what appeared to be living quarters set up inside the warehouse space. The men who caught her were professionals. They moved silently and efficiently, surrounding her before she realized the danger. One moment she was taking photographs of suspicious activity, and the next she was being dragged into the very building she had been investigating. The man who appeared to be in charge was not Volkov himself, but someone who called himself Dmitry. He was calm and methodical in his questioning, making it clear that they knew exactly who she was and what she had been investigating. They had been watching her just as carefully as she had been watching them. "Miss Martinez," Dmitry had said in accented English, "you have caused us considerable inconvenience. We know about your conversations with Elena Popescu. We know about your research into Mr. Volkov's business interests. The question now is what we should do with you." The warehouse where they held her was part of a complex of 4 buildings, all connected by underground tunnels that allowed for movement between structures without being seen from the street. Sarah counted at least 15 other women in various rooms throughout the facility, most appearing to be in their late teens or early 20s. The conditions were deplorable, with minimal food, inadequate sanitation, and constant surveillance. During her first day of captivity, Sarah learned that the operation was preparing for a major shipment. Conversations she overheard between guards suggested that a group of women would be moved to Los Angeles within the week, while others would be sent to work locations throughout Southern California. The logistics were complex, involving multiple vehicles, safe houses, and carefully timed movements to avoid law enforcement detection. What troubled Sarah most was the efficiency of the operation. These were not amateur criminals operating in desperation, but a sophisticated network with resources, planning, and connections that extended far beyond what local law enforcement could handle. The men spoke multiple languages, maintained detailed records, and operated with the precision of a legitimate business enterprise. On her second day, Sarah witnessed the arrival of a new group of women. They were brought in during the early morning hours, transported in a container truck that backed directly into one of the warehouse loading bays. The women appeared disoriented and frightened, clearly having endured a long and difficult journey to reach San Diego. Elena had been right about the documentation. Sarah observed guards maintaining detailed files on each woman, including photographs, personal information, and what appeared to be assignment schedules for different work locations. The paperwork was kept in a secured office area on the second floor of the main warehouse building. The security was tight but not impenetrable. Guards worked in shifts, with the night crew being smaller and less vigilant than their daytime counterparts. Sarah began to map out the patrol patterns, looking for any opportunity to either escape herself or get word to the outside about what she had discovered. Her journalism background proved valuable in observing and memorizing details that might prove crucial later. She noted the names mentioned in conversations, the schedules discussed by guards, and the layout of the entire facility. If she could survive this ordeal, she would have enough information to expose the entire network. But survival was far from guaranteed. On her third day, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her realize her situation had become even more desperate. Dmitri was discussing her fate with someone on the phone, speaking in rapid Russian that she couldn't understand. However, his tone and the expressions of the other guards made it clear that keeping her alive was becoming more of a liability than an asset. The rope around her wrists had been tightened each day, a psychological pressure designed to break down her resistance. Her hands were beginning to lose feeling, and she knew that permanent damage was possible if the circulation remained restricted much longer. More immediately threatening was the growing impatience of her captors with her refusal to reveal her sources or provide information about what she had shared with her editor at the Tribune. As night fell on her third day of captivity, Sarah heard increased activity throughout the warehouse complex. Vehicles were arriving more frequently, and there seemed to be preparation for some kind of major operation. Whether this represented an opportunity or increased danger, she couldn't determine. What she didn't know was that her disappearance had not gone unnoticed. Her editor at the Tribune had contacted police when she failed to appear for a scheduled interview and hadn't responded to phone calls or emails. More significantly, Elena Popescu had overcome her fear long enough to contact a victims' rights organization when she learned that the journalist who had tried to help her had vanished. That organization had connections to law enforcement agencies specializing in human trafficking cases, including a joint task force that involved both local police and federal agents. Among the federal agents assigned to the case was Colonel James Morrison, a Navy SEAL who had transitioned to working with immigration and customs enforcement on complex international trafficking operations. Morrison had been tracking Volkov's network for over a year as part of a larger investigation into trafficking routes between Eastern Europe and the American Southwest. The disappearance of a journalist investigating the same targets had elevated the case to urgent status, bringing additional resources and attention to what had previously been a slow-building investigation. As Sarah tried to find a comfortable position against the warehouse wall, fighting the pain in her bound wrists and wondering if she would live to see another sunrise, she had no way of knowing that help was closer than she dared hope. The same thorough research skills that had led to her capture were about to become the key to exposing one of the largest human trafficking operations on the West Coast. Colonel James Morrison crouched behind a shipping container 2 blocks from the warehouse complex, studying the tactical intelligence spread across the tablet in front of him. The infrared surveillance images showed at least 20 heat signatures inside the main building, with additional movement in the connected structures. After 18 months of investigation, the moment to strike had finally arrived. Morrison's background made him uniquely qualified for this type of operation. 15 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him to analyze complex tactical situations, while his recent transition to immigration and customs enforcement had given him expertise in the specific challenges of human trafficking cases. What made this case personal was the systematic cruelty of Volkov's network and the vulnerability of the victims trapped within it. The intelligence gathering had accelerated dramatically once Sarah Martinez disappeared. Her editor at the San Diego Tribune had provided Morrison's team with copies of all her research notes, revealing the depth of her investigation into Volkov's operations. Combined with information from Elena Popescu and other sources developed over months of patient police work, they now had a complete picture of the trafficking network. The financial trail alone was staggering. Volkov's organization was generating millions of dollars annually through forced labor, moving women between locations throughout the Southwest and maintaining operations in at least 6 major cities. The sophistication of the money laundering operation rivaled anything Morrison had encountered during his military intelligence work. But tonight was not about financial crimes or long-term investigations. Tonight was about rescuing Sarah Martinez and the other women being held against their will in the warehouse complex. Every hour of delay increased the risk that the captives would be moved to other locations or that Sarah's investigation would cost her life. Morrison's team consisted of 12 agents from multiple agencies, including IC, FBI, and local SWAT personnel. The complexity of the target required careful coordination between different law enforcement entities, each bringing specialized capabilities to the operation. The warehouse complex presented particular challenges due to its size, multiple buildings, and underground connection tunnels that could allow suspects to escape or move hostages to different locations during an assault. The tactical plan called for simultaneous entry into all 4 buildings to prevent the movement of captives or evidence between structures. Morrison would lead the team entering the main warehouse where intelligence indicated the prisoners were being held, while other teams secured the remaining buildings and established perimeters to prevent escape. Timing was critical. The surveillance team had identified a window between guard shifts when security would be at its lowest. The night crew was smaller and had demonstrated less discipline in their patrol patterns than the daytime guards. However, the window of opportunity was narrow, requiring precise execution and coordination between all teams. Morrison reviewed the building schematics one final time, noting the location of the office area where documents were likely stored and the holding areas where hostages had been observed. The infrared imaging suggested that most captives were located on the ground floor of the main building, but heat signatures on the second floor indicated guard positions and administrative areas. The colonel's experience in overseas operations had taught him that situations like this could change rapidly once contact was made with hostile forces. His teams needed to be prepared for multiple contingencies, including the possibility that guards might attempt to harm hostages rather than surrender. The psychological profile of Volkov's organization suggested they would prioritize destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses over engaging in direct confrontation with law enforcement. At 11:45 p.m., Morrison gave the signal to begin final approach. Each team moved to their assigned positions using predetermined routes that avoided the main surveillance cameras while maintaining visual contact with the target buildings. The operation required absolute silence until the moment of simultaneous entry, when overwhelming force and speed would prevent organized resistance. Sarah Martinez had no way of knowing that rescue was imminent. Her 4th night in captivity had brought increasing desperation as she observed preparations for what appeared to be a major movement of prisoners. Throughout the day, guards had been sorting through the captive women, apparently selecting individuals for transport to different locations. The selection process was methodical and chilling. Guards consulted documents that contained photographs and personal information, making decisions based on criteria that Sarah could only guess at. Some women were marked for immediate transport, others for longer-term detention at the current location. The uncertainty was psychological torture for everyone involved. During the afternoon, Sarah had been questioned again by Dmitry, who seemed increasingly frustrated with her refusal to provide information about her sources or reveal what she had shared with her newspaper editor. The interrogation had become more aggressive, with threats becoming more explicit and immediate. "Miss Martinez," Dmitry had said, "your situation has become untenable. We cannot continue to house you here indefinitely, and your knowledge of our operations makes release impossible."
You must understand that your choices have become very limited.
The implication was clear, but Sarah had maintained her silence about sources while trying to buy time by providing carefully chosen information about her research methods. She revealed enough about public records and open sources to seem cooperative without compromising Elena Popescu or other individuals who had provided sensitive information.
As midnight approached, Sarah noticed increased activity throughout the warehouse.
Vehicles were being positioned for loading, and guards were moving with greater urgency than she had observed during her previous days of captivity. Several women had already been moved from the holding area, apparently to prepare them for transport. The noise from vehicle engines and loading equipment would later prove fortuitous for Morrison's team, as it masked the subtle sounds of their approach to the warehouse complex. By 11:55 p.m., all teams were in position and awaiting the coordinated signal to begin the assault. Morrison positioned himself near the main entrance to the warehouse where Sarah was being held. His team included specialists trained in hostage rescue operations, with specific protocols for situations involving multiple captives and unknown numbers of armed guards. The colonel carried specialized equipment including flashbang grenades designed to disorient defenders without causing permanent harm to hostages who might be in proximity. The infrared surveillance continued to provide real-time intelligence about movement inside the buildings. Morrison could see that most heat signatures were concentrated in the ground floor areas, with regular patrol movements that suggested guards were maintaining heightened alertness despite the late hour. The timing of the operation would need to account for these patrol patterns to achieve maximum surprise. At exactly midnight, Morrison's radio crackled with confirmation that all teams were ready for synchronized entry. The colonel took a deep breath, remembering similar moments during his military career when lives depended on split-second decision-making and flawless execution. The difference tonight was that the lives at stake included innocent civilians who had been brutally victimized by criminal exploitation.
All teams, this is Morrison. Execute, execute, execute.
The simultaneous assault on all four buildings began with the detonation of flashbang devices at multiple entry points. The intense light and sound were designed to create maximum confusion among the guards while minimizing risk to hostages who would be disoriented but unharmed by the devices. Morrison's team moved through the main entrance with practiced precision, immediately securing the ground floor area where hostages were located. The colonel personally moved toward the section where intelligence suggested Sarah Martinez was being held, while other team members secured additional captives and began the process of separating victims from potential threats.
The guards' response was confused and uncoordinated, exactly as Morrison had hoped.
The simultaneous assault on multiple buildings prevented them from concentrating their defenses or organizing a coordinated response. Most guards were armed but had not expected a coordinated law enforcement operation of this scale and sophistication. Sarah heard the explosions and saw the brilliant flashes of light through cracks in the walls of her holding area. Initially, she feared that her captors were destroying evidence or moving to eliminate witnesses, but the shouts she heard were in English rather than the Russian and Eastern European languages she had become accustomed to hearing from the guards. When armed figures in tactical gear appeared at her location, Sarah's first instinct was terror that the guards had decided to execute her. It took several seconds for her to realize that these were law enforcement officers, not her captors, and that the nightmare of the past 4 days was finally ending. The first officer to reach Sarah was Morrison himself, who immediately began working to free her from the ropes that had bound her wrists. His calm, professional demeanor helped to reassure her that she was genuinely being rescued rather than transferred to an even worse situation.
Miss Martinez, I'm Colonel Morrison with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here and get you medical attention.
The relief Sarah felt was overwhelming, but her journalist instincts immediately kicked in as she realized the significance of what was happening around her. This was not just her rescue, but the exposure and destruction of an entire criminal network that had victimized countless women over months or years of operation. As Morrison helped Sarah to her feet, she could see other members of his team moving throughout the warehouse, documenting evidence and securing the other captive women. The scale of the operation was impressive, but what struck her most was the professional competence of the law enforcement personnel and their obvious concern for the welfare of the victims they were rescuing. The initial phase of the assault had been completely successful, but Morrison knew that the most dangerous moments often came after the initial contact. His team still needed to clear all areas of the complex, secure all evidence, and ensure that no guards or administrators had escaped to potentially retaliate or restart operations elsewhere.
The warehouse complex erupted in controlled chaos as Morrison's teams systematically cleared each building.
Sarah watched in amazement as law enforcement officers moved with military precision through areas that had been her prison for 4 terrifying days.
The professional coordination between different agencies was unlike anything she had witnessed during her years covering crime stories for the Tribune.
Within 20 minutes of the initial assault, Morrison's teams had secured all 4 buildings and detained 18 suspects, including Dmitry and several other key administrators in Volkov's network. More importantly, they had freed 37 women from various forms of captivity, ranging from recent arrivals who were still being processed to individuals who had been held for months in different locations throughout the trafficking pipeline. Sarah remained close to Morrison as his teams worked, partly for security reasons but mainly because her journalist instincts were firing on all cylinders. Even while receiving medical attention for the rope burns on her wrists, she was observing and mentally documenting the largest human trafficking bust in Southern California history. The scope of evidence being collected was staggering. The second-floor office area yielded boxes of documents that confirmed everything Elena Popescu had described and more. Financial records showed connections to trafficking operations in Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Denver. Computer files contained photographs and personal information on hundreds of women who had passed through the network over the previous 3 years. Most disturbing were the detailed schedules and assignments that treated human beings as commercial inventory. Morrison personally supervised the evidence collection from the administrative areas while coordinating with federal prosecutors who were already preparing for what would become one of the most significant human trafficking cases ever prosecuted in federal court. The documentation was so complete that building the criminal case would be straightforward, but the colonel's immediate concern was ensuring the safety and welfare of the rescued women. "The evidence here is overwhelming," Morrison explained to Sarah as medical personnel examined her injuries. "Your investigation provided the foundation that made tonight possible, but what we've found here goes far beyond what any of us expected." This network was operating like a sophisticated business enterprise. Sarah learned that her disappearance had triggered an accelerated timeline for the law enforcement operation. Morrison's team had been building their case methodically, but her capture forced them to move more quickly than originally planned. The irony was not lost on her that her investigative work had both endangered her life and ultimately led to the rescue of dozens of other women. The colonel explained how different pieces of the investigation had come together in the weeks following her disappearance. Elena Popescu's information had been corroborated by surveillance operations and financial investigations. Other women who had escaped from Volkov's network at various times had been located and interviewed, each providing additional details that filled in gaps in the overall picture. Federal agents had been monitoring electronic communications from the warehouse complex, recording conversations that provided real-time intelligence about the organization's structure and operations. Combined with financial surveillance and physical observation, they had developed a comprehensive understanding of how the trafficking network functioned. "The challenge," Morrison told Sarah, "was that we needed to act quickly enough to prevent you from being moved or harmed, while ensuring that we gathered enough evidence to completely dismantle the network. If we had moved too soon, other cells in different cities might have escaped, and the leaders could have rebuilt the operation elsewhere." The rescued women presented immediate logistical challenges for law enforcement. Many were foreign nationals without proper documentation, having had their identification papers confiscated by their captors. Others had been in the country legally but had become victims through deception about employment opportunities. Each case would require individual attention from immigration specialists and social service agencies. Morrison had anticipated these challenges and arranged for representatives from victim assistance organizations to respond to the scene. Spanish, Romanian, and Russian interpreters were standing by to help with initial interviews and to explain to the rescued women what was happening and what resources were available to help them rebuild their lives. Sarah observed the careful attention Morrison's team paid to treating the rescued women as victims rather than criminals, despite their uncertain immigration status. This approach reflected both legal requirements and genuine concern for individuals who had already suffered extensive trauma. The colonel's background in military special operations had apparently taught him the importance of winning trust and cooperation from civilian populations in complex situations. The scope of Volkov's network became clearer as investigators examined the seized documents and computer files. The organization operated safe houses in 6 states, maintained relationships with corrupt officials at border crossings and transportation hubs, and had established legitimate business fronts that provided cover for moving large amounts of cash and facilitating document fraud. Financial investigators discovered that the network was generating over $15 million annually through various forms of forced labor, including domestic work, agricultural labor, and hospitality industry positions where workers received little or no compensation and faced constant threats of deportation or violence if they attempted to escape. This was not a local criminal enterprise, Morrison explained to Sarah. This was an international operation with sophisticated logistics, significant financial resources, and connections that extended far beyond what we initially suspected. Your investigation exposed the tip of an iceberg that was much larger than any of us realized. The tactical phase of the operation concluded successfully, but Morrison knew that the real work was just beginning. Prosecuting the case would require months of additional investigation to trace financial connections and identify other participants in the network. More immediately, ensuring the safety of witnesses and providing appropriate services to victims would require ongoing coordination between multiple agencies and organizations. Sarah's role in the case was complicated by her dual status as both victim and witness. Her investigative research had provided crucial intelligence that made the operation possible, but her captivity meant that she would also be a key witness in the prosecution of her kidnappers. The Tribune had already assigned additional reporters to continue covering the story, allowing Sarah to focus on her recovery and preparation for eventual testimony. The media response to the raid was immediate and intense. By morning, news crews were gathered outside the warehouse complex as federal agents continued processing evidence and transporting suspects to detention facilities. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being part of the story rather than simply reporting it, a perspective that gave her unique insights into how major law enforcement operations actually functioned. Morrison arranged for Sarah to be interviewed by federal prosecutors within 48 hours of her rescue, while her memories of conversations and observations were still fresh and detailed. Her journalist's training proved valuable during these interviews, as she had unconsciously documented far more information about the trafficking operation than typical kidnapping victims would retain. The colonel also ensured that Sarah received comprehensive medical attention and counseling support, recognizing that even brief captivity in such circumstances could have lasting psychological effects. His military experience had taught him that trauma responses could be delayed and unpredictable, requiring ongoing attention rather than just immediate crisis intervention. As the immediate aftermath of the rescue operation continued, Sarah began to process the broader implications of what she had uncovered through her investigation. The story she had stumbled onto while researching construction permits had revealed a criminal network that was victimizing hundreds of women and generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. More personally, she realized that her commitment to thorough investigative journalism had nearly cost her life, but had also led to the rescue of dozens of other women and the exposure of crimes that might have continued indefinitely without intervention. The experience had given her a visceral understanding of the courage required by sources like Elena Popescu, who risked their own safety to expose wrongdoing. Morrison visited Sarah in the hospital where she was receiving treatment for dehydration and the injuries to her wrists from prolonged restraint. The colonel wanted to personally ensure that she understood the significance of her contribution to the investigation and to discuss the ongoing security considerations related to her eventual testimony against the trafficking network. "Miss Martinez," Morrison said, "your investigation saved lives. Not just your own life, but the lives of the women we rescued and potentially hundreds of others who might have become victims if this network had continued operating. That took tremendous courage and professional skill." Sarah appreciated Morrison's recognition of her work, but she was more interested in understanding how the law enforcement investigation would proceed and what the rescue operation meant for combating human trafficking more broadly. Her journalist instincts were focused on the bigger picture and the systemic issues that allowed such networks to operate successfully. The colonel explained that Volkov himself had not been present at the warehouse complex during the raid, but that federal agents were actively pursuing him and other senior leaders of the organization. The evidence collected during the operation would likely support charges against dozens of individuals in multiple jurisdictions, potentially leading to one of the largest human trafficking prosecutions in recent history. What impressed Sarah most about Morrison was his obvious commitment to ensuring that the rescued women received appropriate support and services rather than simply being processed as evidence in a criminal case. His approach reflected an understanding that successful prosecution required genuine concern for victim welfare, not just efficient case management. The colonel's background had taught him that complex international criminal networks could not be defeated through single operations, no matter how successful. Dismantling Volkov's trafficking organization would require sustained effort across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, combined with ongoing attention to the social and economic factors that made women vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. As Sarah prepared to leave the hospital and begin the process of returning to her normal life, she realized that her experience as both investigative journalist and kidnapping victim had given her a unique perspective on one of the most serious criminal justice issues of the modern era. The story she would eventually write would be informed by insights that no amount of external research could have provided. 6 months after her rescue, Sarah Martinez stood before a federal courthouse in downtown San Diego, preparing to testify in the trial that would determine the fate of Dmitry Kozlov and 17 other defendants charged in connection with Volkov's human trafficking network. The investigation that had nearly cost her life was about to reach its legal conclusion, but the impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. The federal prosecution had become a landmark case in human trafficking law, establishing new precedents for interstate commerce charges and financial crimes related to forced labor. Morrison had spent months working with prosecutors to build an ironclad case using the evidence seized during the warehouse raid, combined with testimony from dozens of victims who had found the courage to speak against their former captors. Sarah's role as a witness was unique because her journalist background allowed her to provide detailed, credible testimony about the systematic nature of the trafficking operation. Unlike many victims who had been traumatized into fragmented memories, Sarah had unconsciously documented the organizational structure and operational methods she observed during her captivity. The months following the rescue had brought both satisfaction and challenges for Sarah. Her series of articles about the trafficking network had won national journalism awards and led to policy discussions at the federal level about improving victim services and international cooperation in combating human trafficking. However, the psychological impact of her experience had required ongoing counseling and support. Morrison had remained in contact with Sarah throughout the prosecution process, both as the lead investigator and as someone who understood the unique pressures faced by witnesses in complex criminal cases. The colonel's military background had given him experience with individuals who had endured traumatic experiences while serving in dangerous situations, perspective that proved valuable in supporting Sarah through the legal process. The trial itself revealed the full scope of Volkov's network, which prosecutors demonstrated had operated in 9 states and involved connections to trafficking organizations in Eastern Europe, Central America, and Southeast Asia. Financial investigators had traced money flows that totaled over $40 million over a 4-year period, representing one of the largest human trafficking enterprises ever prosecuted in the United States. Marcus Volkov himself had been arrested 3 months after the warehouse raid, captured in Miami while attempting to board a private flight to Panama. His arrest had been the result of coordinated international law enforcement efforts, involving cooperation between American agencies and police forces in 6 other countries. The evidence against him was overwhelming, built on the foundation of documentation seized during Morrison's operation. Elena Popescu testified early in the trial, describing her own experience within the trafficking network and explaining how she had eventually escaped to contact victims' advocacy groups. Her courage in coming forward had been instrumental in the initial investigation, and her testimony provided crucial context for understanding how the network recruited, transported, and controlled victims. The trial also revealed the sophisticated methods Volkov's organization used to avoid detection and prosecution. They had corrupted officials at border crossings, maintained relationships with legitimate businesses that provided cover for their operations, and used violence and threats to prevent victims from seeking help or cooperating with law enforcement. Sarah's testimony focused on the systematic nature of the operation and the detailed record-keeping that treated human beings as commercial inventory. Her observations about the administrative structure, the rotation of victims between different locations, and the financial controls provided prosecutors with evidence of the deliberate, organized nature of the criminal enterprise. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to challenge Sarah's credibility by questioning her motives for investigating the trafficking network and suggesting that her journalism had unnecessarily endangered other victims. However, Morrison's testimony about the investigative timeline and the evidence discovered at the warehouse complex supported Sarah's account of discovering the network through legitimate research into public records. The colonel's testimony was particularly powerful because of his military background and his expertise in human trafficking investigations. Morrison explained how Sarah's initial research had provided crucial intelligence that enabled law enforcement to map the entire network and plan an operation that minimized risks to victims while maximizing the collection of evidence. Throughout the trial, Morrison coordinated with victim services organizations to ensure that the rescued women received appropriate support and protection. Many had been relocated to different cities for their safety, while others had chosen to return to their home countries with assistance from international humanitarian organizations. The colonel's approach emphasized long-term victim welfare rather than just short-term prosecution needs. The prosecution presented evidence that Volkov's network had victimized over 300 women during its 4 years of operation, generating profits that were laundered through real estate investments, legitimate businesses, and offshore financial accounts. The scale and sophistication of the operation shocked even experienced federal prosecutors who had handled other human trafficking cases. Defense strategies varied among the different defendants, with some claiming they were minor participants who were unaware of the full scope of the operation, while others argued that they were following orders from superiors without understanding the criminal nature of their activities. However, the seized documents and recorded conversations provided clear evidence of deliberate participation in the trafficking scheme. Sarah found testifying to be emotionally challenging but also professionally satisfying, as it represented the culmination of investigative work that had exposed serious crimes and led to justice for victims. Her experience as both journalist and victim gave her testimony unique credibility and impact that contributed significantly to the prosecution's case. The trial lasted 3 months, with the jury deliberating for 5 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against all defendants. Volkov himself received a sentence of 40 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, while other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years depending on their roles in the organization. Morrison attended the sentencing hearing, where federal judge Patricia Hendricks commended the investigation and prosecution as exemplary in its attention to victim welfare and its thorough dismantling of a complex criminal enterprise. The judge noted that the case would serve as a model for future human trafficking prosecutions and praised the cooperation between multiple agencies and international partners. Following the conclusion of the trial, Sarah received numerous offers to write a book about her experience and to speak at conferences about human trafficking and investigative journalism. However, she chose to focus on continuing her journalism career while also working with advocacy organizations to improve services for trafficking victims and to educate other journalists about recognizing signs of human trafficking in their communities. Morrison returned to his work with immigration and customs enforcement, applying lessons learned from the Volkov case to other investigations of international criminal networks. The colonel's experience with the case influenced his approach to future operations, emphasizing the importance of victim services and international cooperation in combating sophisticated trafficking organizations. The warehouse complex where Sarah had been held was converted into a training facility for law enforcement agencies, where officers from around the country learn about human trafficking investigations and victim-centered approaches to complex criminal cases. Morrison occasionally serves as an instructor at the facility, sharing his experience with the Volkov case and emphasizing the importance of thorough preparation and coordination in major operations. Elena Popescu eventually testified before Congress about the need for improved services for trafficking victims and stronger international cooperation in combating human trafficking. Her courage in coming forward had been instrumental in exposing the network, and her ongoing advocacy work helps other victims find the support and resources they need to rebuild their lives. The financial assets seized from Volkov's organization were used to establish a victim services fund that provides support for trafficking survivors throughout the Southwest region. The fund covers counseling services, job training programs, legal assistance, and emergency housing for individuals working to escape trafficking situations or rebuild their lives after rescue. Sarah's relationship with Morrison evolved from professional cooperation during the investigation to ongoing friendship based on shared commitment to combating human trafficking. The colonel's military background and her journalism experience provided complementary perspectives on how to effectively address complex social problems through coordinated professional action. 2 years after the trial, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on investigative journalism and human trafficking, where she shared the platform with Morrison and Elena Popescu. Their presentation focused on the importance of cooperation between journalists, law enforcement, and victim advocates in exposing and combating trafficking networks. The impact of the case extended far beyond the specific prosecutions and sentences. Federal agencies implemented new protocols for human trafficking investigations based on lessons learned from Morrison's operation. Academic researchers studying the case contributed to improved understanding of how trafficking networks operate and how they can be most effectively disrupted. Sarah continues her journalism career with a deeper understanding of both the power and the risks inherent in investigative reporting. Her experience taught her that thorough research and persistent investigation can expose serious crimes and lead to justice for victims, but also that such work requires careful attention to safety and security considerations. The Volkov case became a defining moment in Sarah's career and, in Morrison's law enforcement experience, representing the kind of complex, dangerous work that requires both professional expertise and personal courage. Their collaboration during the investigation and prosecution demonstrated how effective cooperation between different professions and agencies can achieve results that would be impossible through individual efforts. Years later, Sarah would reflect that her 4 days of captivity had been the most terrifying experience of her life, but also the most meaningful in terms of its impact on other people's lives. The investigation that had nearly cost her everything ultimately led to freedom for dozens of women and justice for crimes that might have continued indefinitely without intervention.